An economy is not a complicated thing. It just has a lot of moving parts, but the basic is there's a transaction. And that transaction means somebody makes a purchase. They make a purchase of a good, a service, or a financial assets. That purchase can be made with money or credit. If money, when you make a purchase with money, you end the transaction. You don't owe anything. When you make it with credit, then there's a liability. You have to come up with the money because a credit, a debt, is an obligation to deliver money. So there's a basic transaction. There's spending, in other words, the total amount of money and credit spent on a good or service. And then there's the item that you're buying, a stock, a bond, a car, a bushel of wheat. There's that transaction. Demand is best measured in terms of spending. I think in traditional economics, it's a mistake to measure it in terms of the quantity of goods. What is given up in a purchase is money or credit. What we go through is we go through a cycle. We go through a credit cycle. Credit can be created. It's not created through the velocity as is commonly believed. It can be created out of thin air. If I go into a store or I have somebody paint my house and I say I'm going to pay you later, I've created credit. That'll count in GDP. It'll be an item of production. So what we have is a credit cycle.
According to Ray Dalio's analysis and study of history, there are short-term and long-term credit cycles. Short-term cycles last a few years, perhaps 5 to 10 years. These periods are also known as business cycles, the ups and downs of economies and financial markets. Typically, a business cycle, or a short-term credit cycle, begins with a strong economy where businesses and consumers are in good health and can borrow to spend and invest. Initially, this activity drives economic growth further, and as the GDP climbs higher, more borrowing is being undertaken. This continues until there is more debt in the economy and markets than the income needed to service it. At this point, facing a market crash and economic recession, central banks step in and lower interest rates so that the cost of servicing all the debt goes down. These short-term debt cycles continue for decade after decade, and each time central banks do broadly the same thing: lower interest rates. However, once interest rates hit zero, as they have done all over the developed world after the 2007-08 financial crisis, we have reached the point of the long-term debt cycle. Long-term debt cycles are made up of multiple business cycles that can span 10 or more decades. In a short-term debt cycle, as central banks intervene to prevent a crash, the policymakers essentially do not allow all the misallocated capital to be cleared out, and new debt is taken on top of old debt that can be serviced at a lower interest rate. However, once the long-term debt cycle reaches its end, central banks run out of options.
If interest rates are too high, then you lower interest rates. Lowering interest rates has the effect of making it easier to service the debt. It has the effect of making items cheaper to buy on credit because the monthly payments are less. It has a present value effect on assets. So if you lower interest rates and you have something that has a cash flow, let's say a piece of real estate or something, they have a present value effect. It causes those assets to go up. That produces wealth, and that allows more borrowing. And so when you get to a situation where you can't lower interest rates anymore, let's say you hit zero, that part of the cycle ends. So then you go to a deleveraging. Now a deleveraging, deleveraging means that you can't raise debt relative to income anymore. When you can't raise debt relative to income anymore, the cycle begins to work in reverse.
We are now at the very end of a long-term debt cycle that began as World War II ended. In the world right now, total debt has reached almost $250 trillion, according to the International Monetary Fund. This represents 320% of global GDP. In other words, each $1 produced by the global economy needs to service $3.2 of debt. Clearly, the math does not add up. A giant deleveraging is just around the corner. As Russia invaded Ukraine, energy prices have pushed inflation across the world through the roof. Europe in particular is facing decade-high inflation levels, with some countries like the UK already seeing double-digit inflation numbers. Add on top of this the massive stimulus packages pushed by the governments during 2020, which essentially grew the amount of money and credit in the economy in absence of strong demand, and central banks are in a difficult position. raise interest rates to fight off inflation and thus risk a pronounced deleveraging that comes with a market crash and depressed economic growth, or allow inflation to go higher, add pressure on consumers, and close down small businesses. Such a dynamic can lead to massive social unrest. So far, the Federal Reserve, the Bank of England, and the European Central Bank have increased interest rates, sparking fear across financial markets. As interest goes up, the cost of debt goes up, and the value of discounted cash flows go down, leading to a sell-off in risk assets like equities, which then reduces the collateral used to borrow against during good times, pushing the system further into the deleveraging and so on until the whole thing collapses. On top of this, as the Federal Reserve tightens monetary policy, the US dollar moves higher. This is because a less accommodative Fed policy ultimately means less US dollars in the system. In practice, this makes US dollar-denominated liabilities to be even harder to service. Remember the Turkish crisis that started in 2018? That happened because Turkey borrowed too much in US dollars but ran out of greenbacks, leaving the country without any means to pay back the debt. A total of $182.4 billion of debt in hard currencies must be paid back or rolled over in the next year. But Turkey is just one example. In that figure of $250 trillion of global debt, we have three main actors: governments with government debt, companies with corporate debt, and consumers with household debt. Each country has different debt dynamics across these three layers. For example, latest figures show that the United States has a lot of government debt, but not too much corporate debt, relative to other countries. But the Eurozone, however, has more corporate debt than household or government debt. A global deleveraging, however, will affect everyone no matter where they are in the world because of the interconnected of the global economy. So when the debt cycle goes in reverse in a major player like the US or Eurozone or China, then the whole world goes in reverse. Economic growth goes down, markets crush, savings are wiped out, and recessions become depressions.
Ultimately, you have to bring down the debt-to-income ratio. The ways that ultimately you'll have a balance of those three things. Those three things, again, you're going to have a certain amount of transfer of wealth, you're going to have a certain amount, let's call them four things, a certain amount of austerity, a certain amount of debt write-downs, and a certain amount of printing of money. The debt write-downs and the austerity are deflationary. The printing of money is inflationary. If you can get the balance right of those things, then you have what I call a beautiful deleveraging.
Can we have a beautiful deleveraging as Dalio and perhaps all of us prefer? The cards seem against this outcome. High inflation already makes printing of money and lowering of interest rates unlikely. Austerity and some form of wealth transfer seem more plausible. For example, the International Monetary Fund, IMF, recently reported private and public sector's debt, globally, is at the highest levels in 50 years. A large part of the increase has come from corporations which, taking advantage of really low interest rates for the past 15 years or so, have geared up, borrowed more and more to either make acquisitions or buy back shares. The impact of all of this is clear for the IMF. Current levels of private leverage are expected to exert some drag on future GDP growth. Estimates based on cross-country aggregate data point to a cumulative 0.9% slowdown over 3 years for advanced economies and a cumulative 1.3% slowdown for emerging markets. Stripping away the jargon, this means that the amount of debt alone is a drag on economic growth. Imagine what will happen once this debt becomes more expensive to service, once interest rates go up. A global recession is on the books. Even the World Economic Forum is warning that global debt is rising rapidly, calling the current levels of debt dangerous. This is indeed the case in a late-stage, long-term debt cycle, like the one we are in right now. The most highly indebted governments, households, and firms will be hardest hit by significant interest rate rises. The latest Geneva report on the world economy highlights that debt and credit are closely linked to financial crises, to the evolution and shape of the business cycle, and to the likelihood of negative tail events. Financial vulnerability is endemic in a highly leveraged world. In a time of such record-high debt, it is difficult not to be pessimistic about our future economic, financial, social, and political stability. One might even conclude that debt needs to be urgently reduced. However, let us know in the comments what you think is going to happen to the inevitable deleveraging of the current long-term debt cycle. As always, thank you for watching. And if you want to see more content like this, hit the like button and subscribe.